everybody. Mark Levin here. This is Hour 3, our final hour of the year. How about that? The number, 877-381-3811, 877-381-3811. We have our senator from Florida, Senator Marco Rubio, who has taken a very firm stand against what Obama has done for a number of reasons. Senator, how are you?
I'm doing well, Mark. I'm glad to be part of your last hour of 2014.
You believe that?
Yeah, year flies by. What an eventful year here.
Yeah, and in many ways, just a terrible year. Yeah, exactly. Now, Senator, first of all, in November, at a committee hearing in the Senate, you questioned the now Deputy Secretary of State really aggressively, relentlessly, and asked him if something was brewing with our relationship with the communist regime in Cuba, and he said repeatedly under oath, no. Is that correct?
Yeah, what I asked him repeatedly was, is there going to be any unilateral concessions? Are we just going to, lift, sanctions on Cuba in exchange for them promising some economic opening? And he said no. And if you think back, he actually didn't lie, because what they did was they lifted sanctions without any concessions, not even economic ones, basically. This was a one-sided deal. And if I could take a moment, Mark, because this is not an issue that people have followed closely throughout the years. Cuba's not usually in the headlines. Here's what people have to understand, and I respect people who have a different opinion, who want freedom to come to Cuba, but think that the best way to do it is by lifting the embargo. But here's why they're wrong. Cuba's economy is not our economy or virtually any other economy. There are no private businesses there. The entire economy is controlled by a holding company, basically, that is run by the military. So every penny that goes into Cuba, whether it's a tourist or remittances sent to family or people coming back to visit or increased trade and telecommunications, every penny goes to that company. They take about 9 out of every $10, or 90% of the funds, 92% of the funds, into their own pocket. And then, of course, they have to pay people some salary, but it's literally about $60 a month on average, sometimes less. So they are not going to change that. They've already been very clear that they are not going to change that system. All that's going to change here is there is now going to be more money going into Cuba, meaning more money going into the pocket of these folks. And what that means is they're now going to be able to solidify themselves in power forever after a transition. So people say, well, what's the big deal? This is a relic of the Cold War. Who cares? There's 3 reasons why we should care. The first is Cuba's government is an enemy of the United States. In every international forum on the planet, they consistently vote against our national interests. They are aligned with Assad. They are aligned with Iran. They are aligned with Gaddafi before that. They're aligned with Putin. They're aligned with Maduro in Venezuela. On every issue, they're never on our side. Number 2, they are inviting the Russians to come back. They have, for example, a spy station in a place called Lourdes that they're now reactivating. They're negotiating for the Russians to start basing naval assets in Cuba again. Cuba is probably the number 3 country in the world in terms of espionage against the United States. They spy against us actively, and they sell those secrets to other countries. And they are a state sponsor of terrorism. Last year, the Cubans were caught trying to send to North Korea weapons systems that are in violation of UN sanctions. And they were caught in the Panama Canal, and the ship was seized, and it was coming from Cuba. No one disputes that. And my last point about Cuba, one of the things that people forget is the entire Latin America, Western Hemisphere, was full of dictators. Up until the late 1980s and early 1990s, democracy started to spring up. And now, virtually every country in the region has some form of democracy, although in Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Nicaragua, that's starting to erode. What the administration is doing by recognizing them diplomatically is they're sending a message that it's okay to be a dictator. The U.S. is fine if you're a dictator. We recognize countries that do that as legitimate and valid governments. So now if someone decides that they're going to go back to a dictatorship in the hemisphere, why not? America appears to be fine with it under Barack Obama. And let me tell you what dictatorships lead to. They lead to mass migrations. They lead to economic and political instability. They lead to civil wars, all of which end up impacting us. We have entire communities of immigrants in this country who came here from Nicaragua, from El Salvador, from Cuba, fleeing the kinds of instability that's created by dictatorships. And we already have a mass migration problem, and this will only make it worse. So for all those reasons, this is just a terrible, terrible thing that's happened.
Well, that's a very, very good sketch of what's going on and why this won't work. And I guess my next question to you is, How can a president do this? Well, we see he did it without consulting anybody in Congress. I mean, it just kind of pops up one day.
You know, he has certainly not felt like Congress or the separation of powers or the Constitution, for that matter, is a limit on him. But it's going to be interesting. The embargo against Cuba was codified back in 1996 when the Cubans shot down. People forgot this. There were 2 American planes that used to fly. These are just, small little Piper aircraft that used to fly the Straits of Florida over international waters, and they would spot rafters, and they would call the Coast Guard, who would come and rescue them. 2 of those planes one day took off on a Saturday in 1996, and 2 Cuban MiGs shot them down. By the way, one of the spies that was traded to Cuba was involved in that. He was the one that gave all the secrets about when those flights were going to take off and allowed the MiG pilots to shoot them down. 3 American citizens were on those planes. They were murdered in international waters. After that happened, the U.S. imposed, or basically codified, put in law, the U.S. embargo against Cuba. So it'll be very interesting now to do a legal analysis of how what the president has decided lines up with those sanctions and whether, in fact, they're in violation. So I'm curious to see when these regulations come out whether the president has once again exceeded his control. And if he has, of course, we're going to address it very forcefully.
And those spies were convicted in our courts, weren't they?
Yeah, 5 of them were convicted in our courts. 2 of them served their sentences, were released, went back to Cuba and stayed. The other 3 were still in our possession. One of them was accused of, was an accessory to murder, basically, was conspiracy to commit murder.
But here's my question. How can Obama trade them without pardoning them first?
He did pardon them. I mean,
he pardoned them.
Oh, absolutely. He commuted their sentences, I should say, and using his presidential authority, he commuted their sentences in federal court. They were released. And they were greeted in Cuba like heroes. And just to tell you the difference between the Cuban government and the American government, this is kind of a simplistic way to look at it, but I think pretty graphic way to look at it. Alan Gross returned to the U.S. having lost 100 pounds, barely able to walk, and missing multiple teeth. The 3 prisoners that were in U.S. custody returned to Cuba. All 3 are overweight. Seems to be healthy and probably on the overweight side, and obviously very well fed and very well treated while in U.S. jails. Mm-hmm. And by the way, Alan Gross was not a spy. All he was doing in Cuba was helping the Jewish community get access to the Internet. That's what he was in jail for. He was a hostage.
Mm-hmm. Now, there seems to be a little dispute between you and Rand Paul. What's that all about?
Well, I mean, I think it's unfortunate that Rand has decided to adopt Barack Obama's foreign policy on this matter. Look, for me, the interest in Cuba, obviously, I know people in this community who have family members that were executed by this regime. I know people in this community that served 30, 20 years in jail. I know people in this community who still have loved ones in Cuba who are being persecuted. Every single week, this is a matter of daily course. Do you know that on Tuesday of this week or Monday of this week, the Cuban Coast Guard rammed a boat full of migrants that were seeking to flee Cuba, overturned the boat. One of the people is missing and presumed dead. This happened the night before or the day before this deal was announced. There are human rights violations in Cuba every single day as a matter of course. So you have these people coming out and saying, well, we should try something different. Basically, and that's what Rand did. He just basically repeated the talking points of the president. And that's fine. He has every right to support the president's foreign policy. That's what he wants to line up with. But I'm telling you, it isn't going to work. This notion that somehow by doing this there's going to be change in Cuba is just not true. On the contrary, it's going to strengthen the regime, who is openly bragging in Havana. They said it again today. In Cuba, nothing's going to change. They're not going to change their system of government. They're not going to change their economic system. And what they are openly saying is that this is a victory against imperialism, that they have won. And they've spent all day yesterday thanking their partners internationally for standing with them all these years. I mean, it's just the president gave away everything, and nothing in return, no democratic opening, nothing in return.
You know, this notion, I am a free market capitalist. I believe you are as well. And the notion that is going to somehow overthrow an ingrained communist regime. I mean, even in China, they have gulags. They execute people. There is no real due process. They've got political prisoners. If you have more than 2 kids, you're punished. It's a police state. They own 51% of every major industry. People keep pointing to China. Look at China. Look at China. I'm looking at China. They're using all this money to build up one of the biggest militaries on the face of the earth. They claim the South China Sea, the East China Sea. They're taking the Vietnamese underwater rights. They're taking Japanese islands. They're threatening the Philippines. I mean, this isn't nirvana.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the difference between China and Cuba is there was actually a geopolitical reason for us to recognize China in the late 70s, and that was to split them off from the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War. So at least it was a geopolitical reason. The second thing people forget is that much of what's happened in China economically had to do with the fact that they opened up their economy. They'd opened it up before we ever recognized them. They were already doing it because they were going bankrupt. Aside from that, I would say that since that time, there was Tiananmen Square, there was massacres there, and look at China today. Yes, they have more millionaires than they did 20 years ago, but it happens to be the people that are the closest to the government. They steal our intellectual property. Any American company that goes in China and does business will have their ideas stolen from them, and then they'll give it to a Chinese company and force you out. They hack into our computers. They're building a massive military buildup. They are threatening their neighbors, as you said, in the South China Sea and beyond. And they act against our interests everywhere in the world. To somehow point to China as something we hope Cuba will become is, in my mind, absurd.
Well, I'm of the same mind. I think it's absurd, too. And, there's one other point I would mention, Senator. Communism has as its focus the destruction of the civil society. It's more than the destruction of capitalism. It's the destruction of the civil society. This is what Marx talked about and Engels talked about and so forth and so on. I don't care how many McDonald's you put somewhere. The fact of the matter is, unless that society is transformed, in other words, unless the people who control it and prevent the civil society from flourishing are somehow removed, introducing trade, even limited free trade and so forth, the idea that that's going to remove a police state is absurd. I can't think of a single case in which that's happened.
Not only that, in Cuba, first of all, children are taught that the state is superior to their parents. If children hear their parents talking bad about the government, they're encouraged to turn their parents in. That's what's happening in Cuba. In Cuba, the state has always been supreme to the family or any other institution in society. And then none of that is going to change. I mean, I understand if you told me there were reciprocal steps, let's say Cuba decided we're going to allow political parties to organize, we're going to allow freedom of the press, and in exchange for that, we're going to expand travel to Cuba. I would be wary of such a deal because I don't know if they'd keep their word, but at least you could say there was a reciprocal step here. In this case, what we basically did is, what the president did is he said more telecommunications, more commerce, banking, all these, we're going to recognize you diplomatically, we're going to open an embassy, we're going to send an ambassador, and the Cubans agreed to nothing. I mean, they basically have, and in fact, not only have they agreed to nothing, they have been very open over the last 72 hours and reminding everyone in Cuba, by the way, this is a one-sided deal. Don't expect any changes politically or economically in Cuba as a result of this. So I just don't understand what got into them other than what you've outlined. Can I say one more thing? I don't want to leave this program with forgetting.
I've got 2 minutes, so go for it.
I don't know if you picked this up.
Yeah.
The other day when the president spoke, he apologized to the Cuban people for American colonialism.
Oh, I know. Unbelievable.
I don't know what he's talking about. The U.S. never had a design on making Cuba a colony. The U.S., Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders in San Juan Hill, very well-known story, went in, helped the Cubans win their independence from the Spanish, and in 1902 gave the country back to the Cuban people after they had stabilized it and said, here, it's your country, and move forward from there. There is no sense of colonialism. The U.S. and Cuba had very strong relations. In the late 1950s, Cuba was not a perfect country, but there were more people immigrating to Cuba than from Cuba. It had very strong links to the U.S., not perfect, had someone in charge of that government that was a dictator himself, but it was a country that was an ally of the United States. We have a country that for 55, 57 years has been an enemy of the United States and continues to be that. That did not change on Wednesday when the president made that pronouncement.
Yeah, we almost had a nuclear war as a result of this. And,
we did.
Why do you think, I've got 1 minute, why do you think Obama did this?
Well, a couple points. I think one is we can't forget that I think his foreign policy team is surrounded by people that have always felt some level of sympathy to left-wing governments around the world, and that includes, I think, the one in Cuba. If this was a right-wing dictatorship, there was no way this deal would have ever happened. Mm-hmm. But I think the principal reason is a combination of truly being, just naive to the reality of how the world works, or willfully ignorant of the reality of the world. I think it's a pattern of what he's done elsewhere. It's what he tried to do when he said Assad was a reformer. I mean, our Secretary of State is a person who went around as late as 2009 saying Assad was a reformer. You see the outreach to the Iranians, where they're basically giving away the store. So this is a pattern of behavior on their part. And last but not least, I think he's desperate for a legacy. He wants to say that he's Nixon going to China by going to Cuba. Huge differences. Nixon visited China, but we didn't recognize China diplomatically until the 1970s. And even then, there was a geopolitical reason for it. And by the way, I don't think China should be a model of what we do in the future.
No.
And today, the Chinese government is the most well-funded dictatorship in human history.
Mm-hmm. I think Neville Chamberlain would be better than Nixon, in the comparison. Senator, Merry Christmas to you and your family. Thank you very much, sir.
Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. I look forward to talking to you next year.
All right, you take care. There you have it, folks. I'm right up against it, and I will be right back.